Okay, so in today's demonstration, we're going to be looking at the exercise for Blender project-specific techniques from Blackboard. So we're going to be looking over working with 3D lighting, looking at the properties, how to add lights to your scene and modify them. We'll also be looking at working with your 3D camera that is set in your scene to be able to view or navigate a rendered scene angle. And then we'll also be looking at how to work with textures and coloring 3D forms inside of Blender. Now I'll break this up into several videos, so we'll look at it in different chunks. So let's start off with working with 3D lighting. Will be the first one. I'm going to go ahead and open up my scene and get that loaded into Blender. And remember, if you need to set any user preferences or mouse settings for your mouse to better navigate and work in Blender, I would recommend you take care of that now. Pause the video and get that taken care of. That way you can use it a little bit more efficiently. But let's go ahead and hop in and talk about 3D lighting. So in terms of working with lighting in general, lighting is, again, kind of one of the most important parts of working with three-dimensional form or working in an environment. It's important in film and video, definitely important in things like animation, understanding a work of art. Light changes our interpretation of everything. Without it, we can't really see much of what we're looking at or even understand how to interpret it or change it. So light has a lot of effects on an environment. So as far as working with it in Blender, first thing I want to do is actually identify what our 3D light is inside of our scene. So to start off, if you look in your 3D scene, you may notice in one of your viewports perhaps that there is a little black dotted circle located in your 3D scene somewhere. You may have to pan around your scene to find it, but this is mine right here. It's this funny little dot that has a little line that extends straight down to where my 3D grid is on screen. Just to basically show that it lights down to a ground plane. But this is the basic light that's set up in Blender. We can actually select it either directly in scene, or you can use your outliner panel over on the upper right of your screen. There's a listing for your light called lamp. And it may have a little orange light bulb icon to signify your lamp in your scene. And the basic light looks like this. This is actually what's called a point light. It acts like an incandescent light bulb, so it kind of gives an aura of light in sort of a 360-degree sort of globular kind of sense in all directions. Typical incandescent lights shine for a certain distance and then they fall off and the light sort of dims as it gets further and further away from the source. And that's something we'll talk a little bit more about that lighting shares. But once you've identified where your light is inside of your 3D scene, go ahead and find it and click on it. And make sure you have your quad view turned on so that way you can actually move and manipulate the position of the light more effectively. If you don't see your light in the scene or in your outliner list, you may have deleted it at some point by accident. That's okay. All you need to do to add a new light to your scene is go down to the Add menu when you're in object mode. But go down to Add, and you can choose from the Lamp menu to add a new point light to your scene if you need to. And that will drop a new light in. All right. Once you've found it, we're going to actually switch viewport shader preview to be able to see what the lighting does to the model. Because right now we're in object mode and we are in basic solid preview, which is shown with this little white sphere on our 3D menu down below. And when it's just a solid sphere, like the lighting doesn't really have much effect on the scene at all. Like it doesn't change anything. Blender just has kind of a generic default assigned light inside the scene when you're in solid mode, and that can't be manipulated. But let's change our viewport shader down below from solid to material. Now, when you jump into material mode, you should immediately notice a difference in the way that your scene is shaded. For the most part, you may notice, like, depending on where your light is in the scene, your model may appear black, or it may be very bright, it may be very dark or dim. But for a point light system, point lights, again, they have a limited distance that they can be from the subject or the model before the model sort of falls off into darkness. So you want to make sure that that light is near your model. Now I'm navigating in the top view to move my light around because my light is already at a decent height level just to see the model. And it's much easier to slide the light around in the top view because it doesn't move it up and down as I try to make it move through the environment. Again, make sure you know where your light is located inside of Blender when you have it selected. If you need to zoom out on like one of your particular viewports to find it, then please do so and make sure to move it into your scene. Also make sure that it's not hidden behind your cyclorama and that it's actually inside where your model is. All right. Again, keep the light nearby if you want to help it shade your model a little bit better. Okay, so this gives you a preview of how light affects your model. Again, this is the basic point light, so you can see how it sort of shades or brightens up a very small area and then sort of tapers off into darkness as it gets further away from the source. Make sure your light doesn't end up inside your model, by the way. I've had students do that where they suddenly find out my model is not showing, it's actually black, and my light is not helping light it. And the reason for that was because it was buried inside the middle of their model and making it incredibly dark instead of bright. So make sure that your light source is outside of your model and just nearby. So again, you can use each of the viewports to carefully place or move around your light. Like if you need to change its height, I would recommend using like the front view, since that's where our model is visible from, to change its relative height in the scene so that it's not necessarily lit from the middle, but it could be lit from above or lower down below. And then you can use the top view to kind of spin it or orbit it around your object. All right. So that's moving around your light and identifying it in your scene. Now what I want to show you next is actually how to manipulate the properties for the lighting inside of Blender. And to do that, we're going to go over to our properties panel on the right side of the screen. So I'm just going to pull up my properties panel here. And the properties panel is actually below the outliner, and it's the one with the little strip of icons. That's the same panel that we would have found our modifier menu from last time, from our last exercise. But an interesting thing to notice with the property panel, depending on what type of object you have selected in your scene, the properties options will change. So while I have my light source selected, the properties are narrowed down to whatever's available for a light source in Blender. So to access our light properties, what we're going to do is click on this icon in the properties list that looks like a yellow sun with little arrows shooting out the corner of it. And this is your light properties. So make sure you activate that little guy. And by the way, you won't see this icon if you don't have your light source selected in your scene, just to make that clear. So make sure your light source is selected. That way you can get to this icon. All right. So let me talk about properties that you can use or that I recommend you can adjust to get some basic changes out of your light. So looking down below in our light properties or lamp properties, we have a preview window first that shows you the effect of the light source on a flat background, just so you can understand the shape of the light, its energy level, its color, all of those things. If we look below the preview window, we have a section called lamp, and there are a few settings in here that you can change. Number one, when you're looking at the option for point, which is the option we have turned on for our current light source, there's a white bar that's right under point, and that's actually a bar to change the color of your light source. So if you click on that white bar, you can pull up a color wheel for your light. And again, that's just from clicking on this little white bar that's right below the word point. And this allows you to click and drag or click and select specific hues for changing your color if you want to influence your scene. You can also, there's a little vertical value slider next to the circle that you can click and drag on to change whether or not it's a bright or a dark shade, or even a darker light source. And that's just by using this sort of black to white gradient slider. But this is kind of entertaining in that you can sort of simulate lighting sort of gel systems that might be used in sort of stage lighting and other lighting situations in the real world. You should keep in mind that when you change lighting in a scene to a color gel, that it does influence the overall color of your model, and it may overpower the color that your model actually is. So you have to be careful with the intensity of color that you use on a gel. Sometimes subtlety is kind of the best way to go with it. All right, when you're done with that, you can just move your mouse outside of it. So that's playing with the color of your light source, and that's pretty much available for any light. Below that is an option called energy. Energy is actually the power, how much power the output light source creates. So if you click and drag where it says energy, you can change the power level of that respective light source. Anytime you see this in Blender where there's a name, value, and a value attached to it inside of this sort of oval ellipse kind of little button, you can click and drag inside of that to adjust the values of it. And that's under energy. All right. After energy, some other things you can change with this particular light is something called fall off. So under fall off, there are these two options, a black button that says inverse square, which just tells us about how the decay of the light is shaped over a distance, and then actually a button that says distance, and that dictates how quickly the light shades from bright to darkness. Like a regular light bulb, again, it will fade off into darkness the further you get from the source. So if you click and drag on distance and shorten that number, the output of your light bulb shrinks dramatically and causing it to light less of the scene. So that's what distance does under fall off that you can adjust if you want to. The last section we'll look at is this part that says shadow down below. And shadow actually gives you the ability to tell your light source to actually cast shadows onto the scene. By default, when you're looking at your model in material, the material shader preview, it doesn't show shadows casting into the scene, by the way. Notice that your model doesn't cast anything. It might have shadows on the model, like around the back of it, but there are no model shadows cast into the scene from the object. If you want to preview that, you actually need to change your shader from material to rendered, and you actually get a preview of your shadow cast into the scene from your light source. So that's just from changing your shader down below for rendered. Now, again, rendered shading is only good for previewing. You don't want to leave it on that permanently. That's just for previewing. Always switch it back to material or solid when you want to go back to editing on your model. All right, so I'm going to go back to material. But you can kind of see the effect of what the shadow looks like on the model. And under the shadow settings for your lamp property, you can actually adjust the quality of the shadow. Right now it says sample is set to 1, which is very low quality. If you amp that up, like I'm going to take it up to about 17, and all of my renders are going to update slowly. But what it does is that it actually softens the shadow accurately as it becomes more distant from the actual source of the shadow. So it starts to get a little more soft and fuzzy around the edges in the distance. And that's more accurate. So you can play with that if you want to. It's not a requirement, obviously, but if you want to have fun with it, you're welcome to it. All right. Obviously, you can also tell it to not cast any shadows by clicking on this big button that says no shadow. and then it's just the model on its own. All right. So that's playing with the basic point light inside of your scene. Now I'm going to switch my view rendering, my shading back to material. And from this same lamp property window, we can convert any light source that we have selected into a different Blender light source. So if you look over in your properties for your lamp, under the section that says lamp, it's selected on point. That's what's colored blue right now. If I switch point, I'm going to go over to this light that's called spot. So switch to spotlighting. And spotlighting is what it says it is. It simulates an actual can light or stage light. So it's actually a light that's recessed into a tube. And it allows for a focused beam of light to show into the scene. It's also what's considered a directional light source, so it has to be aimed at its subject in order to see the object. It's not like the point light where it shines light in all directions. So let me tell you a little bit about how to navigate the spotlight tool so you can play with it effectively if you want to. So first things you notice when you turn on the spotlight. Number one, it's in the shape of a cone. To simulate how it casts light into the scene. If you zoom out a little bit on any of your windows, make sure you can see the full structure of the light source. So it should look like a complete cone. But in order to navigate it and work with it, again, working with a sort of broken up quad view structure is very helpful. Number one, I'm going to move it from my top view and just slide it around until it's more accurately aimed at my subject. And that I can actually see my subject a little bit better with it. That's just from the top view. And then I might go to my front view to change its relative height in the scene so it can fully light my model. You may notice that with the spotlight, it actually gives you a preview of what the shadow will look like in the scene. So it actually casts the shadow from the light source onto other surfaces, which is kind of cool. So it helps you understand that aspect of it, what direction it's aimed in. But again, it is a directional light source. The lamp does have a little single line that extends down from the center of the cone to indicate what direction the lamp is aimed at. And so that helps you understand where it's pointed. You can rotate it using your rotate controls. Again, using shortcut like R in whatever window your mouse is over will allow you to rotate the light to change its angle in your scene. I recommend when you're rotating stuff, work with the top and the front view angle ports to more accurately reposition the light source. So again, I use rotate in the front view to do the basic rotation over here. And then in the top, if I wanted to spin it around, I could, if I need to, by hitting R to redirect it. And then I can reposition it. And so that's just navigating with the spotlight in the scene. Again, the spotlight itself is a specific tool that does have to be told where to aim, which is very different than your point light. So just be aware of that. If there's anything outside of the cone area that the light is shooting at, it's not going to be lit. So as I lower my light source down, notice how parts of my model get cut off in the lighting. Now, that's just kind of moving it around the scene, right? Let's look at some of the properties for a spotlight, because these change now because it's a very different light source from our point light. So over here in the properties area, we still have the basic lamp controls, like energy and color can still be changed. Fall off can still be changed with this because this is a fall off based light source, so light will decay over distance and disappear into black. You still have the same shadow options pretty much. In case you're wondering what each of the shadow buttons do, there's one that says no shadow, buffer, or ray. Buffer shadow is like a preview, and ray is more accurate. It takes longer to render a ray trace shadow, but they look more accurate. Beyond those two basic settings for lamp and shadow, we also have a setting called spot shape. down at the bottom of the properties area for our spotlight. And this allows us to change a couple settings of our spotlight, like the size of it is set based on degree angle. So if you change the degree slider, you can make it a more focused light source where it's very narrow, or you can widen it up significantly to cast more light into the scene. And that's just by changing the size of the spotlight. You can also play with other structures they have here, like blend will allow you to make the light source more soft around the edges instead of hard edged. So you can actually soften its approach to the scene with how it lights around the edges. And that's by using the blend slider. You can also change the shape of the light from circle to square by using a checkbox down here that says square. So if you change it to square lighting, then it actually makes a square shape out of your light source instead of a round circle projection. The last one down here that might be helpful is the one that says show cone. Sometimes people turn that on to understand the preview of where the cone is aimed in 3D space in order to use that feature, just to see how it's projecting into the environment. The show cone feature, like the rest of this light, is not visible whenever you render the final image. So it just kind of disappears. But it's helpful to understand projection into a scene. Some people will actually use like scale to scale up the light or scale the light cone down to be able to see how it's going to hit their scene. So if you hit with your mouse in a particular window and hit S, you can scale up just the visualization of the light to better understand what it's going to cover. Or you can scale it down to keep it kind of petite and easier to work with inside of your scene. Again, depending on what you need to do with it.
How do you get the scale?
So you can hit the S key on your keyboard to shortcut to scale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, don't forget those shortcuts. Scale, S for scale, R for rotate, and G for move or grab.
Ooh.
Those can be just helpful on the fly when you're trying to do quick edits. But that's how we can manipulate our spotlight. And those are really the two basic light sources you'll be working with, is point or spot. And again, you can change your light that you're currently selected on to either of those at any time by going to its property and switching the lamp option from point to spot, depending on your need. All right. So we've learned how to kind of manipulate a light and how to move it around. So what now we're going to do is actually multiply the light in the scene, duplicate it a few times, and help light our entire object. So let's do that. So now that we've got a light set up somewhere in our scene, we're going to go ahead and duplicate it. And the first thing I want to do this easily, let's switch our light to a point light so that you don't have to keep redirecting the light source to aim at your subject. So click the button that says point over in your lamp property. And what we're going to do is first make sure that your light is at the right height that you want it at compared to your model. You can play with this any number of ways to help light it. I'm going to put it close to about the same height as the head of my model for playing around with for now. In my front view, I'm going to change the height of it by clicking and dragging. And then in the top view, I'm just going to make sure that the light is close enough to my subject to light it from that angle.
Do we want the energy to be 1 or 4?
The default is 1. Mine just happens to be at 4 because I changed the settings a minute ago. So it's really up to you based on your model design or how you're working with light.
Okay.
Okay, so I've got it positioned in my top view. And now in my top view window, I'm going to have my mouse inside here. And I'm going to hit, to do a shortcut for duplicating any selected thing, I'm going to do Shift-D. And when you do that, slide your mouse away from wherever you did it, and it'll pull out a duplicate of that object. And I'm just going to start positioning these lights around my subject. I'm going to do about 4 of them and kind of make it into a basic square around my subject in the top view. So I'm going to drop one there, do shift again, pull one out, put it towards the back, shift again, or shift D, and drop another one right there. All right. So now what we've done is we've actually created a lighting system or lighting setup to start working with on lighting our model with. Again, it's good to preview this up against your cyclorama in your scene, so make sure that your cyclorama is active and you're not just lighting a random model in your scene, because the final result will be rendered on the cyclorama. So make sure you preview your lighting setup up against that system. But this is where you get the opportunity to play with the relative positioning or power of your various lights inside of your system that you've played with. And there's lots of ways that you can work with lighting as far as lighting an object or a model. Sometimes having one light that actually from the front or quarter angle that does like full lighting on the subject at normal power, and then you might have a light next to it that might do like what's called fill lighting, and that's actually at about half or 3/4 power. And so I might lower the energy level of that respective light source so that it's not necessarily lighting it perfectly, but it does change the way that the light fills the scene. At the end of the day, the goal is to be able to see your object, and you can light it dramatically, but enough to be able to see the object from different angles of view is important. So we don't want to have a side of our object that's necessarily pitch black at this stage, but enough to where you can tell where details are, so you can see what you're doing. All right. And that's how we can do just a basic, very simple lighting setup to get our model kind of illuminated inside of the Blender system. Again, you can change this, play with it in any number of different ways that you want to. Lights will work well for your rendered still images for Blender. These will not transfer out when we look at the critique image in Augment when we're done with the project. Just to put a note on that, it has its own standard lighting system that we'll work with for that aspect of the finishing work for the project. But for creating kind of interesting angles of it, make sure you've got a lighting system that lights the model decently. All right. Now that's all we're going to cover in terms of dealing with the light setup inside of Blender. Again, feel free to toy around with that and experiment with it. But we'll stop this particular video at that, and we'll pick up in the next video to talk about 3D cameras. So we'll go ahead and stop it now.